Emily, darling, give us a picture of what you're interested in.
Okay, well, I hope this new one works all right. You all can hear me? Okay, good. Several years ago, I did a survey asking people whether they had ever experienced any of a number of the kinds of things that we're interested in. Near-death experiences, past life memories, out-of-body experiences, apparitions, that sort of thing. And I learned about a lot of really interesting experiences that way. But maybe the most interesting thing I learned was that the single most often reported experience was being at the bedside of a dying person who seemed to be talking with and seeing someone who was not physically present. Usually someone who had died earlier, such as a spouse, a parent, a sibling. There's been virtually no systematic research done on these so-called deathbed visions, and so I really had no expectation about how common they might be. But in addition to the survey, I've also, over the years, talked to a lot of hospice workers who tell me that these experiences, in fact, are quite common. In fact, one hospice doctor told me that he has learned that when such visions start, it's time to call the family and make sure they're there. In addition to the dying person, sometimes people at the bedside will also have unusual experiences. And sometimes shared by the dying person, sometimes not shared by the dying person. And this actually happened in my own family. My grandmother had had a stroke, and she was at home dying. She was in a coma, and her son-in-law was sitting beside the bed with her. He himself was a physician. And all of a sudden, he saw, standing at the foot of the bed, my grandfather, who had died about 7 years previously, with his arms outstretched to my grandmother and calling out her name. And a few moments later, my grandmother died. Another kind of experience that actually has been studied quite a lot over the years is something that we call crisis cases. And these are experiences that happen not at the bedside of a dying person, but some distance away, and often quite a long distance away. A typical experience of this kind is one in which a person sees a vision, sees an apparition of a particular person, and then later learns that that person had in fact died at about the time of the vision. Over the years, there have been reported literally thousands of these experiences, reported and investigated, thousands of these experiences. And I learned about a few more in my survey, some very interesting ones, but one in particular that I found very interesting was not an actual vision, but involved a physical event. And I wanted to just read to you the description that the woman who had the experience sent to me, because she expressed it a lot better than I could. The day my grandma died, I was headed out to work about 3 a.m. I knew she was very sick, and I had planned to fly to New Jersey later that day to see her because I knew time was short. As I went to put the key in the car, I felt this overwhelming presence, and all of a sudden, my driver window shattered. And I thought to myself, Grandma just died. As I got to work, I could not shake the feeling of Grandma right next to me. The phone call came. Grandma died at the same time I felt her, and that the window shattered. I felt this was Grandma's way of telling me she's gone. Now, I don't have any idea how often car windows shatter spontaneously, but I don't think we can attribute this experience to chance. There's still another kind of experience that we are particularly interested in learning about, and we call these revival cases or terminal lucidity cases. And these are involve people who are suffering from Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia and who seem to recover their mental faculties shortly before they die. Again, I learned about some of these in my survey. One woman in particular wrote to me about her grandmother. Her grandmother had had Alzheimer's, and for quite some time she had not recognized anyone. But shortly before she died, she seemed to recover, and the woman actually had a conversation with her, a normal conversation in which they sort of went over family affairs, family events, things that had been happening. The woman told me, she said, it felt like I was talking to Rip Van Winkle. Another experience like this that was a similar one that was reported was actually reported in a special issue of Time magazine that came out several years ago. It was reported by a physician named Scott Haig. And this special issue of Time was devoted to talking about the mind-brain problem, mind-brain issues. And nearly all of the issue, or really all of the issue, was taking the position that is the predominant position in science today, which is that the brain produces the mind, produces consciousness, and that therefore consciousness is totally and wholly dependent on the brain. Well, Dr. Haig wrote a little essay that took quite a different position, and what he did was he described a case of his, a patient of his named David, who had brain cancer that had literally been eating away much of David's brain, so that toward the end of his life, he was completely unresponsive. One night, Dr. Haig went home and he knew that David was going to die that night. And he did. He died that night. When Dr. Haig got back to the hospital the next morning, the nurse came up to him and said, you know, last night David woke up and was able to talk to his family before he died. Now, these experiences, these sort of revival cases, I think are extremely rare. We know about a fair number of them, but I think they are extremely rare. But they're also extremely important because they suggest that as the brain is shutting down, the mind is somehow being freed. As Dr. Haig put it, he said, that night, David's mind somehow broke through his diseased brain so that he could say goodbye to his family. As I said earlier, there's been practically no systematic research done on these sort of deathbed visions and revival cases and cases of this sort. There's been a doctor a physician in the UK has started doing some research over there in connection with hospice and nursing homes over there. But there's still so much that just basic information that we don't know about these experiences. Things like how often do they happen? To whom do they happen? Under what circumstances do they happen? One of the most important questions that we know very little about is what's the relationship between drugs and these deathbed visions? We do have some preliminary information that suggests that drugs may actually inhibit the experience and not cause them. But again, this is something we just know very little about at this point. So we here at our group wants to start a study here in Charlottesville, and I'm now in the process of looking for funds to support this, but I don't know how many of you all were here last night, but as John said last night, funds for this kind of research ain't easy to find. But I'm optimistic that we'll be able to find it, and maybe in a few years we can come back to the Tom Tom Festival and give you an update on what we found.
Thank you.